Uh, I think I don't think Gil needs any introduction. Gil Harel. He's becoming very well known in Fairfield County libraries here, New Canaan, Stamford, and he and his wife Amy just bought a house in Fairfield, so he's here to stay. Um, can you hear this? Oh, do we all know what a musicologist is? Good, but if you don't, Gil's going to explain that to us, as well as Beethoven's Symphony number 5 and 7. And do we know that fate was knocking at the door? If not, thank you, Gil.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And thank you for coming out, folks. So yeah, let's start with musicology. What exactly, did I make that title up? Am I inventing titles for myself? No, a musicologist is a real thing. This is an academic term that academicians use to describe the study of music where you encompass various outside disciplines. So for example, musicologists should know a bit of theory, in some cases quite a bit of theory, in other cases perhaps not. Depends on the musicologist. Musicologists also study, obviously, history, biography, theology, language, and so in order to have one word that encompasses all of these various disciplines, which are, I would suggest, necessary to the understanding of music, we have this term musicologist. So if you were to look at the diploma hanging on my wall, it says musicology. Of course, you might have trouble finding that diploma because my wife has about 7 diplomas on the wall and I just have 1. She's going to give the next seminar series here. It's going to be on the intricacies of orthodontic practice. It's riveting stuff. So, yes, thank you. A preemptive thank you for silencing your phones. Last week we had 2 cell phones go off in B flat major, and 1 went off in C major, and none of them matched the key of the piece we were looking at, which at that point was the Eroica in E flat major. So it's a good thing we got that out of the way. Welcome back, and welcome to Lecture 3, which is going to cover music at the end of this heroic period, this middle period of Beethoven's life. And we're going to revisit this idea of fate knocking at the door and what that means, not just for Beethoven, but for composers of the next generations. I think that we could draw a dotted line between Beethoven and contemporary music superstars. If we think about the way we perceive musicians today, it's really quite hyperbolic compared to, say, 200 or 300 years ago. And it starts with Beethoven. The idea that musicians are perceived as sort of rock stars, sex symbols. They make millions of dollars, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars. In Paul McCartney's case, I think even more than that. We ought to add another zero to that net worth. How is it that musicians could be perceived this way and treated this way by society? And again, a lot of it starts 200 years ago with Beethoven. Last week, we talked about the Heiligenstadt Testimony. Remember that document we looked at, in which Beethoven discusses his sort of the way he's isolated himself from society and he's become a recluse of sorts. He doesn't interact, he doesn't fraternize, he doesn't socialize, he's not out as Mozart was playing billiards and singing drinking songs and having a stein of beer with his buddies at the tavern. That's not Beethoven. Beethoven instead is thought of and viewed by posterity as somebody who dedicates every aspect of his industry, of his being really, and pours that into his art. And that becomes enormously popular to composers of the next generations. Let me give you one example. Somebody who was living in Vienna when Beethoven was, although he was born about 27 years after Beethoven. His name was Franz Peter Schubert. Schubert could have had any number of jobs. He was offered a job teaching at a school in Vienna, and it would have paid the bills, and it would have been a comfortable position for him. Schubert turned the job down. Well, in favor of what? What job did he want? Turns out he wanted no job at all. Wait a second. What do you mean you don't want a job? You don't want to have a salary and steady income and stability in your life? Well, Schubert didn't want that because following Beethoven's lead, Beethoven was, remember, not employed in a 9-to-5 as we would think of it today, as Bach perhaps could be thought of having a steady job, having steady employment at various churches, especially in the city of Leipzig for the Thomaskirche, the St. Thomas Church. Schubert didn't want that because he wanted to be, I think, like Beethoven. If you take a job, let's say as a school teacher, well, then that's taking away time from the effort that you can put into composing. And if you're teaching these snot-nosed brats, as I'm sure Schubert thought of them, the rudiments of grammar, or perhaps he's teaching music, even if he's teaching music, that time spent teaching is taking away from his time as an artist and as a composer. And so for Schubert and for many composers of the next generations, they looked at Beethoven and saw this model, this idea that you don't write music because that's how you pay the bills, that's how you sell to publishers and you get money and you take commissions here. Those are ancillary details. Sure, that's what happens and that's how you get by. But what's more important is what you bequeath unto posterity. The music you create, not necessarily for that audience in the Quartets Theater in Vienna. What they get to hear in December 1808 when the Fifth Symphony premiered, that's great for that audience. And we still talk about that audience and we speculate as to how they must have reacted when they heard the first strains of the Fifth Symphony the first time an audience had ever heard it. That's an interesting question to contemplate. And it's sort of immortalized that faceless group of concertgoers who braved the frigid temperatures in December of 1808. Again, figure this concert hall, probably not more than 55 degrees Fahrenheit. But people sat there and the program was about 4 hours long. And it featured the Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony in F major first. So actually, the Sixth Symphony premiered before the Fifth Symphony. And at the very end, they get to the Fifth Symphony. Now, you'd think no matter how patient the audience is, no matter how good the performers are, no matter how good the composition is, how many of us today could sit through 4 hours in a frigid concert hall and get to the end of that concert and chant for an encore when it's over? Well, some people, yeah. Now, this gentleman in the back, I'm going to guess that you must like the music of Richard Wagner. If you like 4-hour pieces. You know, I certainly went through a Wagner period. That was a very dark phase of my life, you know, I would say. You get sucked into the ring cycle, and then before you know it, you're skipping social events. Why can't you come? Well, you see, I have to watch Siegfried again, because I want to watch the forging scene. I have to hear it, that part again. Well, anyway, this is, I think, the important thing to take away from this heroic period of Beethoven's life, this middle period. By the way, I want to point out that scholarship is starting to reject this term heroic as a sort of catch-all umbrella phrase to describe this middle period because, as we'll see today, not everything from this, say, 10 or 15-year period of Beethoven's life matches the description of being heroic. The Pastoral Symphony, which I mentioned earlier, the Symphony in F major, is all about nature. It's not about triumphant heroes or revolutionary ideologues, as the Third Symphony certainly was at its beginning. And even, I think, the revised version when Beethoven scratched out that dedication to Napoleon and renamed the symphony the Eroica Symphony and wrote that it was now dedicated not to Bonaparte, but to the memory of a great hero. In other words, the Napoleon that Beethoven had put his hopes and dreams in, this first consul of France who represented the opposition to the oppressive monarchies of Europe, Beethoven had worshipped, but as soon as Napoleon put a crown on his head, he might as well have been dead to Beethoven. That Napoleon ceased to exist, and the tyrant Napoleon had replaced him. Beethoven, of course, would be inspired by the story of Napoleon in a number of pieces, and of course, one of the most egregious examples, a piece that premiered on the same concert as the Seventh Symphony, is a piece that some of you may or may not know. It's known as Wellington's Victory, and I guess you might describe it as a sort of gimmicky piece. In the piece, Beethoven uses the orchestra to conjure up the scene of battle with the Duke of Wellington commanding the forces of France and England against Napoleon's brother. It was a crushing defeat for the French, and it was celebrated widely in Vienna. And Beethoven wrote this piece to celebrate, of course, when he was pitched the idea by a guy named Ignaz Schupanzig. He was pitched the idea, and Beethoven basically said, "That's a dumb idea." And he wrote the music anyway, because a composer is going to write music if they're going to be handsomely compensated for it. And of course, it turned out to be the piece that was the most sensational thing on the program. The audience loved it. What he does is he uses the orchestra to start. He starts with a snare drum pattern that gets louder and louder as if to signify an approaching army. And then we hear Rue Britannia, so we know that it's the British army that's come to defeat the French. Then the music dies down and the drums start up again. And it gets louder as the French army approaches. And then we get the Marseillaise as the French army is approaching. So it's a very interesting piece the first time you hear it. There's tremendous novelty to it, but I would suggest that it wears off rather quickly, as opposed to these symphonies we've been discussing, the third, the fifth, today the seventh, where it seems you could listen to it until you're as old as Methuselah, and you pick something up every time you hear it. You still feel that same thrill, that same sensation of the hair on the back of your neck standing up when you get to a certain moment. And I think we'll see that today when we look at the Symphony number 7. I want to say a few things about Symphony number 5 because it ties in with our discussion from the end of last week's program, and I think it really addresses this question of fate knocking at the door. We said that Beethoven was supposedly asked later in life to talk about that incredibly persistent theme, that 3 short note, 1 long note pattern, ba-ba-ba-bum, from the beginning of the symphony that, as we saw last week, pervades the whole symphony. Remember, it's in the first movement. Which in the second movement. Ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum, which in the third movement became. Ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum. The insistence and persistence of that theme supposedly led Beethoven, when he was asked to address it, he said that it was fate knocking at the door. And it once again conjures up this imagery which is so present in the Heiligenstadt Testimony, the imagery of some force controlling things. Beethoven was not a religious guy. He was not a devout guy the same way, for example, Johann Sebastian Bach was a very devout Lutheran. Bach ended his compositions, he would write on the manuscript, S period D period G. And it was Latin, it stood for Soli Deo Gloria. In other words, this piece for the glory of God alone. I don't think Beethoven thought in those terms. Beethoven might be, and we'll talk about this next week when we look at the Ninth Symphony and analyze the poetry in Schiller's An die Freude, the Ode to Joy. Beethoven certainly believed in a creator. There's a wonderful line in that poem which Beethoven, I think, sets in a very special way. And the chorus sings, Über Sternen muss ein lieber Vater wohnen. Above the canopy of stars, up in the firmament, there must be a loving father dwelling up there. And I think that's really how it must have resonated tremendously with Beethoven, because it seems that that was how he thought about faith and about spirituality. However, he was not a religious person, what you might call an in-the-pews Catholic who's taking communion, partaking of the Eucharist on a regular basis. Beethoven had a very strong moral compass, but it didn't prevent him from getting into trouble and getting into, I think, a real quagmire. And this period that we're going to talk about in this program, as we make our way into the later years of Beethoven's life and what historians and musicologists call the late period, was a real morass for Beethoven, I think, on a personal level. His hearing was, of course, worse than ever. He got into a really nasty custody battle with his sister-in-law after his brother Kaspar died. His brother had a son. His son was about 10 years old. His name was Karl von Beethoven. And Beethoven decided that he should be the guardian of this child. He should take Karl into his home and raise him himself. Now, how many people in this audience think that it would be a good idea for a cantankerous and deaf 50-something-year-old bachelor to take a 10-year-old into his home to raise him as a solo parent? I think most people would agree that's a horrible idea. But it didn't stop Beethoven from pursuing it, and he did for about 4 years, and it was really ugly. And I think, and this is really hard to say, because it grates against our perception of Beethoven as this heroic figure, as we've said many times. We want to believe that Beethoven was a scrupulous person who was in the moral right when he made decisions. And I think that it's fair to say, in the case of this custody battle with his sister-in-law, Beethoven was wrong. Not only was he wrong, he was really mean-spirited. He showed a very callous, very brutal side that it's difficult to discuss, because how do you square that with this veneration, with this quasi-worship, not just from concert goers today and casual listeners who enjoy the music, but from historians over the last 200 years who have to look at the facts and say, gosh, he went to court, lied about his background, claimed that he was from the nobility, that fan and phone were sort of just different spellings, and then he was asked to prove it, and he couldn't, and he was humiliated, and he seemed to take it out on his sister-in-law even more. He accused his sister-in-law of being a malfeasant, unscrupulous woman of loose morals who had a child out of wedlock and was convicted of theft or accused of theft. And he really went out of his way to drag his sister-in-law's name through the mud. This was also a time for Beethoven, I think, of great frustration. This is a time when he's, past his 40th birthday. He's still a bachelor. Clearly, he's interested in women. He has tremendous outpourings of affection for various women. The problem for Beethoven is he always picked the wrong women. He picked women that he had no hope of ever marrying, because he tended to spend a lot of time with these aristocratic women. That was very fashionable, you see, in Vienna. Those were the top clients for his piano lessons, his composition lessons. And so he'd fall in love with these women, and of course, it would never work out, and he would wind up disconsolate, heartbroken, in some cases catatonic with sadness. And this led to some very fallow years for him as a composer, where he seemed to be doing nothing. And we'll talk about that at the end of the program today. The 18 teens were a period for Beethoven that didn't see much action. And then, of course, he comes roaring back in the 1820s when he's now in his 50s. He comes back with renewed vigor, with renewed zeal, and writes some of his most celebrated works. I think what many people would say are some of his greatest works. And as we'll see at the very end of today's program, when we look at his Opus 111 Piano Sonata, some of his strangest works. And I would suggest that for many of us sitting here, when you hear this sonata, if I were to play it for you with a blindfold on and say, who do you think composed this? Beethoven would be maybe number 46 on the list of guesses. Be very far down the list. It doesn't sound like classical music or even romantic music. As we'll see, it anticipates music from hundreds of years, or 100 years later, I think is fair to say. Not hundreds, that would be present day, but it's not that modern sounding, but perhaps 100 years down the road. But we'll listen to it, and we'll revisit that question at the end. So again, this idea, fate knocking at the door, with that iconic rhythm, this is the guiding force of Beethoven's life. He is not writing music because he's fulfilling his obligations to the Leipzig church authorities that employ him. This is not Beethoven writing music because he's got to pay the bills, and it's a job, and this is what he does, and he'll sell out, sure. No, this is a guy who's writing music because it's his destiny to do so, because fate is guiding him in that direction, and he's a conduit. You see, he's a vessel, and whatever comes to him through some higher authority, some higher power. Call him God if you want. Call him a loving father above the canopy of stars if you want to take that language from the Schiller poem that Beethoven meditated on for 35 years before he finally set it to music in the Ninth Symphony. Beethoven knew that poem for a very long time. It's a late 18th century poem, and he had brooded on it and thought about how to give it a worthy musical setting. Well, it took him a while, and he had been deaf for about 20 years when he did it, but he finally did it, and that's going to be our topic for next week, the Ninth Symphony. So before we get started with today's music, are there any questions? I know I've given you a lot to think about. Yes, question? Great question. Yes. So was Beethoven bothered by the legacy of Mozart? No, not at all. Mozart didn't bother him. Haydn did. The reason Mozart didn't bother him, I think, is because, first of all, by the time Beethoven moves to Vienna, Mozart's dead. So at that point, Mozart has given him great music to study and to take inspiration from, and I think Beethoven was very interested in, for example, Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 20, Mozart's Piano Sonata K310 in A minor. He's interested in those things, he's inspired by those things, but I don't think he sees Mozart as competition. Apples and oranges almost. He's doing something different. Haydn was still alive when Beethoven moved to Vienna, and Haydn was his teacher. And I think by the turn of the century, Beethoven was really intent on proving to himself and to the Viennese public that, gosh darn it, I can do what my teacher does, and maybe I can even do it better. But I don't think he was too intimidated or at all resentful towards Mozart's legacy. It should also be pointed out that the Viennese concert-going public and European ears in general in 1800, they were a very fickle group, and their tastes tended to change from year to year in the sense that they wanted what was new and shiny. And so while Mozart's music maintained appeal to many people who were collectors and connoisseurs, and when I say collectors, I mean collectors of sheet music, for example, manuscripts, connoisseurs, people who studied music on a deep level, most of Vienna is not listening to Mozart's music at 1800. Today, we play music mostly composed by dead people. That was not the case 200 years ago. Guess when it starts? The idea of playing music by someone who's no longer with us starts with Beethoven after he dies. It's almost like Europe sort of collectively asks, wait a second, what are we supposed to do now that he's dead? Can we still play his music? And in previous generations, that was not the case. Very famously, J.S. Bach died in 1750, and historians often say that Bach's music was forgotten for about 80 years, maybe even 100 years. The Brandenburg Concerti sat collecting dust for 100 years. Nobody even heard him. Nobody. I think just to a lesser degree with Mozart, and with Beethoven, absolutely the opposite. Beethoven dies in 1827, and people are listening to his music in the months and years after his death. There are people putting on concerts, promoting his music. Some of the great champions of 19th century music, Franz Liszt, for example, Hector Berlioz, made it their mission to program Beethoven. So I know there's sort of a circuitous answer, but I think we answered what is really a very interesting question. Yes, great question. How did Beethoven communicate when his deafness was really pronounced? And the answer is he used little notebooks. And these notebooks, as you can imagine, are a treasure trove to musicologists, because you want to know what did Beethoven have for dinner on Thursday, September 17th, 1822, you look in the conversation books, and they're dated, and you can see that he had, Kartoffelsalat or whatever, potato salad. And because he was asked, what would you like for dinner? And he would, he probably was asked, and he would write back, or maybe he would speak it out loud. His speech was intelligible almost to the end. It became thicker, as anybody who's interacted with people who are hard of hearing know, that if you're not born deaf, you can still speak, and Beethoven certainly did, although his speech became harder to understand as he got older. All right, let's dive into some repertoire. Because we ended with the Fifth Symphony, I want to pick up with the piece on the screen right now, the Appassionata Sonata, which is a work that connects to the Fifth Symphony in some ways. It's a totally different type of work. It's a solo piano sonata. So let's see if we can connect the dots here and see how this connects to the Fifth Symphony. Because some of you who know these pieces are thinking, huh? How are these two related? Well, first of all, let me say that when this was written, it was probably the hardest piano sonata that Beethoven had ever written, and would remain the hardest piano sonata until he would write the Hammerklavier Sonata in the key of B flat major towards the end of his life. It's incredibly challenging and taxing on the skills of the pianist. And I want to play the introduction for you to give you a sense of how Beethoven is once again using simple, real economy of musical themes. He starts here with our old friend from last week. Remember, we talked about the arpeggio. We talked about it in week 1, in fact, this idea of taking a chord and breaking it up into its 3 component notes. That's how this piece starts. And when it gets going, we're going to hear a familiar motive in our ears. So we start here, Pianissimo. Notice again the sense of space, how Beethoven is able to use musical rests to leave us as listeners hanging on every next note that comes. We go on from there and we get the theme finally comes in. It takes them about 2 minutes to get there, but when the theme comes in, we get this very lovely bum ba-dum bum, bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum. So what's happening in this introduction? Very similar to the Pathetique Sonata, which we looked at in week 1. Beethoven starts out with a slow, mysterious opening. He gives us a lot of space, a lot of rests. He gives us a lot of diminished chords. Remember, we talked about those unstable harmonies, things like this. Now flavored with these trills. A trill is, of course, a rapid alternation between tones. So we get things like this. He introduces the opening gesture is really just an arpeggio, right? We start with the chord. Do you hear? It's just a chord, just like we had with the Moonlight Sonata in the first movement and in the third movement. Doesn't matter how fast you go. An arpeggio is an arpeggio. And that's how he begins. Now here's, I think, where our ears perhaps are perking up a little bit. How many people caught this section and thought, that sounds interesting when I get to this? Well, wait a second. That sounds familiar. I know I've seen you somewhere. And in fact, of course, this is the Fate motif. And once again, we could spend a lot of time talking about just this little fragment of music, just this little rhythmic cell. Many composers embrace this cell. Brahms famously does it in his first symphony, also in the key of C minor, just like Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. Mahler does it in his Fifth Symphony. If you think about how Mahler's 5 starts with that trumpet articulating the triplet, da-ga-da-dam, da-ga-da-dam. It's hard to overstate the influence of Beethoven on composers and musicians of various styles, various generations. Even in the last 50 years, there is a symphonic heavy metal band out of Spain, calls themselves Darkmoor, and they have a piece that's based note for note, and it's, these guys shredding on guitars, but playing the notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, note for note. It's not an approximation. It's not some cheap arrangement. They're really doing but in a power metal style. How many people remember, what was his name, Walter Murphy, Fifth of Beethoven, right? You remember, those of you who know it, it starts like this, very familiar strains. And it goes on like that. And you think, wait, what's going on here? It's a disco song. It's a disco song based on Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and it's filled with, a Rhodes organ playing these pentatonic solos. But it's based on Beethoven. Again, the influences, we could spend many hours discussing them. I want to play about 2.5 minutes of the Appassionata Sonata, just so we get a sense of just how much Beethoven is asking of the pianist, how much dexterity is required to execute the physical playing of this piece. So here is Beethoven's Sonata in F minor, the Appassionata. And we stop there right before an abrupt key change. So a little taste of the Appassionata Sonata. If you're interested in listening to the whole piece, the second movement is a beautiful theme and variations in the key of D flat. I would suggest that perhaps the most interesting thing about the second movement is just how economical Beethoven is with what is essentially a very simple theme, and how he's able to generate one variation after another that really breathe life into this very short, very ostensibly simple theme. And then, of course, you get to the third movement, and the third movement is all fire. It is a perpetuum mobile, which is just what it sounds like. So when you play it, you sit down at the piano, you buckle your seatbelt, and you have about 6.5 minutes of nonstop motion. It's really taxing. It's even more so than the third movement of the Moonlight Sonata. It is an exceptionally physically demanding piece. Pianists don't often talk about this because you have to get to a certain level before it becomes relevant. But how many times, some of you, for example, may have taken piano lessons, or you have kids or grandkids who took piano lessons, and what are their typical excuses? They say, well, I don't feel like practicing, or I don't like this piece, or I want to play video games, I want to watch TV, I want to go to play with my friends. They never say, I can't play because my hands hurt. Right? Well, if you practice a whole lot, then maybe so. But when you play something like the Appassionata, especially the outer movements, your hands hurt. It's a strange sensation, because it's very difficult to fatigue the muscles in your hands. But if you play Beethoven, you have to, at some point, you'll come to that crossroads where you realize that this is physically demanding in a way that Mozart, for example, I don't think really is. And I played an awful lot of Mozart, and I love playing Mozart. Vladimir Horowitz famously said that Mozart is great for people under the age of 15 and over the age of 75 to play. All right. We move on now to a piece that dates about 4 years after the Fifth Symphony, and this is Symphony number 7. If we had to choose any symphony to discuss today as a sort of post-Fifth Symphony work, I think the Seventh Symphony is perhaps the most noteworthy, and that's because of its famous second movement, the Allegretto. The second movement of a symphony often is not the most attention-grabbing part of the symphony. Second movements tend to be a bit of what you might think of as a musical respite from the first movement. The first movement, bang, grab your attention, rope you in with a really dynamic theme, with interesting chord changes, with some sort of epic modulation, with a big coda at the end, and leave you breathless by the end of the movement. And that tends to be the effect, I think, that a lot of, for example, Beethoven symphonies have, the Third Symphony, the Fifth Symphony. The first movement is sort of front-loaded, gets a lot of the weight of the piece. So what do you do with the second movement? Second movements of symphonies tend to be very light, very sort of oriented in the theme and variations format, where you can introduce a theme and then spin off some variations on it. Haydn gave us one of the most famous second movements in Symphony number 94, and this is, maybe an exaggerated example, but it's what you encounter in many second movements. Haydn's Symphony 94, movement 2 goes like this. Wake up. What Beethoven does here couldn't be more different than what I just played. It seems that in Symphony Number 7, which by the way is really in the key of A major, it's an unusual key for example, for Mozart or Haydn to write in, but for Beethoven, A major, when it does come up, it raises some interesting questions. It's sort of the opposite end of the circle of fifths from E flat, which we discussed last week as being this heroic key associated with, for example, the Third Symphony, the Emperor Piano Concerto, the song cycle An die ferne Geliebte, On the Distant Beloved, the opera Fidelio. Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit today, just a little bit. In this middle movement, Beethoven, instead of going to D major or E major or some related key, he goes to A minor. He goes to the parallel. So once again, remember we talked about this last week, one of Beethoven's hallmarks, one of the most profound impacts that he makes in music history is, I think, really tackling head-on this dichotomy, this yin and yang relationship that almost all Western music possesses of the major versus minor duality, that opposition between major and minor, and what those two sounds represent to a listener. So if this symphony is 4 movements, and for example, the first and last movements are in A major, and they're based on dance rhythms, and they're upbeat, and they're the last movement especially is this whirlwind rondo. What does he do with the second movement? Well, he gives us this really interesting theme and variations, but it's nothing like the Haydn theme and variations from Symphony 94 or any other number of Haydn symphonies. Here is the second movement of Beethoven's Symphony 7. He starts it out low with the strings, and he gives us what on the surface might look and sound like the most simple, dare I say, even boring theme you ever saw in your life. I'm going to play just the top voice, the melody, and tell me what you think of this melody. Some of you know this piece, so you'll be anticipating it. Here's the tune. This is literally it. Not the most riveting theme. So why is this movement so famous? Why does it grip us today as it must have gripped people 200 years ago? Well, I think once again, we have to look at the arsenal, the tools that Beethoven is bringing to the realm of composition that earlier composers did not deploy quite in this way. In this case, once again, it's rhythm. It's that insistent rhythm. 1 long note, 2 short notes, or if you want to be more blatant, 1 quarter note, 2 eighth notes. Bam, bum, 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 bum. So 2 eighths, quarter, 2 eighths, quarter, quarter. Repeat that pattern. So it's the rhythm that grips us because, as we'll see when I have a special video planned for us to watch, in 2010, the movie The King's Speech. Some of you may have seen that movie with Colin Firth and playing George VI. During the climactic moment where the king has to give the eponymous speech, the producers of that movie, I'm sure they thought long and hard, what kind of music do we want to capture the solemnity, the gravity of this scene? And of course, they went with this movement because it has this sort of inexorable forward motion to it. Let me play a little bit of it. Again, this is courtesy of Franz Liszt, the piano reduction. First, we start on this chord, which on the surface, there may not seem like there's anything so unusual about this chord, right, with this in the bass. But there is a fundamental instability there, and I'm going to just talk about it very briefly. See if you can hear the difference between the 2 ways I'm going to play this chord, this A minor sound. Which one sounded more concrete, more stable? The second one, right? Because it had this nice low anchoring note. This one is an A minor chord in what we call second inversion. And it's a fundamentally unstable chord. To a music theorist would look at it and say, that's got to go somewhere. It's got to move. It's usually something like this. It will resolve. But it's very unusual, unheard of practically, to find a piece that starts on a second inversion chord. Nonetheless, that's where we start, and that's where that melody, remember how riveting it was? let's see what happens when we add the harmony and add the other voices. That's just the opening salvo. What Beethoven's going to do next is he's going to build on that theme. And it's this sense of building which heightens the tension, heightens our sense of anticipation and what should come next and where is this leading to. Remember, we started on that slightly unstable chord. We have this very simple theme. We have this very insistent rhythm, just as we had in the Fifth Symphony. Now we're going to get a middle voice that comes in. We don't often talk about middle voices, but I'm going to isolate it. This is the middle voice in the next iteration. As the melody is doing this, we get this. So let's integrate that theme now and see what the three voices now, bass and top voice we've already heard. We're going to add the third voice. And that's going to be the driving force behind this. It's going to play many times, and as you'll see, as it plays, it will add more. Beethoven's going to add more instruments. He's going to add more moving parts, what we call counterpoint. The adjective is the very arcane word contrapuntal. You Bach enthusiasts will know the word contrapuntal. This piece is actually rather contrapuntal. When it gets going, there are an awful lot of moving parts, independent melodies. Now, the scene we're going to watch from the movie The King's Speech is, as I mentioned, that climactic scene where George VI has to make his address to the nation to announce that Britain is now fighting in the war against Germany, and it's not going to be an easy road, and there will be many sacrifices that will have to be made. Now, what I'd like you to do is, as you're watching it, think about how the producers and directors use the music to enhance the dramatic potency of this scene. So we'll just watch a short clip from this, and then we'll move on to Beethoven's Piano Sonata, Opus 111. So, thoughts, reflections, meditations. It works, doesn't it? Why does it work? Well, perhaps I'm giving these producers a little too much credit, but I'd like to think that in making this decision to use the second movement, the Allegretto from Beethoven's Symphony No. 7 for this very poignant scene, they realized that the music, the cadence of the music, would be perfect for mimicking the cadence of speech, as would be delivered in any high-profile peroration. They also realized that the minor key, which flirts occasionally with major when you get things like this, let's see here, little touches of major here, little things that do this. Do you hear this? Here's major, here's minor. That this vacillation between major and minor, but really the prevailing minor key sound, achieves a very somber mood, which is appropriate for the particular scene. Did you notice Geoffrey Rush's character, who's almost the maestro here, right? He's the king's speech coach, I guess you'd call him, and he's the one who's the maestro here. He's conducting it almost as a conductor would conduct with or without a baton. So very clever use of Beethoven's music here, and I think Beethoven would have appreciated the idea that his music was being used to frame a text which was about confronting tyranny. Beethoven hated the notion that might was right. He was, I think, very hostile towards any absolutist form of government. He was someone, as we said last week when we talked about the Eroica, and a bit today, who really, prized the principles of the Enlightenment, who venerated the poetry, for example, of Schiller because it preached for universal brotherhood. That's what we're going to talk about next week when we get to the Ninth Symphony. All right, for our last piece today, we're going to look at a very strange work by Beethoven from the very last decade of his life. This dates probably to 1820-21. This is his Piano Sonata in C minor, Opus 111. How many people here have felt daunted or intimidated by studying a certain composer and realizing how much that composer wrote, and you sort of feel like you're lost because there's so much to learn, so much within each piece? There are sometimes 3 or 4 movements, and it can leave us feeling overwhelmed. I think people feel that way quite often about the Beethoven piano sonatas because there are 32 of them, and each one is between, say, 25 and 45 minutes long. So you're talking about hours and hours of music, lots of detail, tremendous variety. The spectrum of sound that Beethoven achieves in his 32 piano sonatas is staggering. I think any historian, any casual listener who listened to all 32 would be blown away by many things, but perhaps most of all by the breadth of ideas that Beethoven employs, the sheer different motives and modulations and sounds he's able to coax out of an instrument which was really evolving during his own lifetime. Beethoven grew up playing the light forte pianos of the late 18th century, and when he died, those pianos had been supplanted by, as we said earlier, sturdier instruments that compare more to the modern baby grand piano. The last piano sonata, I think if we take what I said just now about how Beethoven employs and exhausts all the possibilities that are capable in the vocabulary of a 19th century musician, what do you do when you get to the 32nd piano sonata and you've done it all already? That's a good question, isn't it? Well, what he does, I think, in the second movement can be described in many ways, but perhaps one of the best adjectives to describe it might be experimental. There are some strange idiosyncrasies in this piece, and I'll show you one here just on the screen. And I don't know that we'll need to hit the lights for this, but perhaps we will. Okay, yeah, you could see that. So some of us read music, some of us don't. But even if you do read music, anyone want to clap this rhythm for me? Anyone want to sing it? My undergrads complain about a class called ear training, which is a class where they have to look at music they've never seen before and either clap it or sing it, sometimes sing it on solfege syllables. So it's a useful skill to have. The problem with this, what's on the screen right now, if I asked even a very competent musician to sing it, if they had never seen it, sing it or hum it or play it, is the way it's rendered, the way it's actually written out. If you were to just close your eyes and listen to it, well, it would certainly sound unusual, but it's not impossible. However, reading this would be really tricky. So it's probably a little too small to see, but the time signature, which is how we count music and how we plot the metrical patterns in the music, here is not the traditional 4/4 or 3/4. Some of you are looking and squinting and wondering what the heck is that. It says 1232. So Beethoven here, to get back to my earlier question, what do you do when you've exhausted all the possibilities in the piano sonata idiom? The answer is, apparently, you write something in 12/32 time. So for you musicians in the room, and those who are musically inclined and are sensitive to rhythm and time signature, if you try to count 12/32, what it actually means is, of course, that there are 12 beats in the measure, and of all the notes possible, it's the 32nd note which counts as one beat. Huh? Can I name any other piece in 12/32? The answer is no, I cannot. Maybe something by Peter Maxwell Davis, maybe, but nothing that came before it, and I don't even think anything in the 19th century that I can think of can be found in this time signature. So once again, supporting the idea that on some level, perhaps, we might say that Beethoven's experimenting. So what does this music sound like? I'm really glad you asked. Here we have a performance by Mitsuko Uchida. It would be interesting to watch a performer actually play this, but I think it's even more interesting. Even if you don't read music, I think perhaps it's more interesting to try to look at the score, because a lot of that innovation is something that's, of course, going to be sonic and aural, and we'll pick it up with our ears, but I think it's important to point out, as we've said, a lot of the innovation here is in the written transmission of this music. And just how experimental it is really can be, I think, more fully appreciated when we're looking at the sheet music. So if you don't read sheet music, don't worry. I will be mousing along to try to highlight the contour and where we are roughly in the piece. If you don't read music, I still think you'll get a lot out of this. If you do read music, I think you will be thoroughly confused and disoriented by what you're about to hear. So we're going to back it up just a couple of minutes. This sonata, by the way, only has 2 movements, so that in itself is pretty unusual for piano sonata to eschew the traditional 3-movement form. Here we only have 2 movements, and the second movement is like 20 minutes long, almost, not quite, about 18 minutes in a performance. So it's a massive piece. We'll listen to just a bit of it, and then we'll wrap up before we go home. So here is the second movement of Beethoven's Opus 111 in C minor. All right, we'll pause there. Yeah, that's Mitsuko Uchida, by the way, is the pianist in this recording, and this is known as the Fats Waller variation. So I think to many listeners, this conjures up the sound of jazz. Of course, the problem is that jazz doesn't exist for at least another, say, 80 to 100 years from the time this piece was composed around 1820. So what are we supposed to make of this? Well, what we would say about it is that, once again, rhythmically, Beethoven is shattering barriers. He is changing, forging a new style, and opening possibilities for successive generations of composers. And I think it's not unfair to draw a dotted line. When we talk about jazz, some of you may hear me speak about jazz. I'll be at the Ferguson Library, Harry Bennett branch, on Monday talking about jazz. And one of the things that's sort of central to jazz is the subdivision of the beat into a sort of uneven, asymmetrical, long, short, right? Bam, bam, ba-dam, instead of bam, ba, ba, bam, ba, ba, bam. It's what sometimes we call the swung eighth note. We swing the eighth note, or we make the eighth note asymmetrical, long, and short rather than even. Well, forget eighth notes. You don't get eighth notes in 12/32 time. But it has that feeling, right? This idea that instead of doing something more sort of traditional eighth notes, it's not that. It's this division of the beat, or what the ear perceives to be the beat. Anyway, who knows what the beat is in this piece? What the beat is actually incredibly difficult. If you were to really map out each 32nd note, it becomes a real bugbear to puzzle out. Nonetheless, the way the ear perceives the beat is going to, I think, resonate with many listeners and immediately conjure up the world of jazz. So once again, with Beethoven, we see a different side of this composer and just how innovative he was. People often talk about Beethoven sort of perfecting the genres and the idioms of the classical period, but I think it's fair to say that by 1820, he's not really working with classical genres at all anymore. He's creating something new. Now, he didn't think of it as romanticism or jazz or anything like that. But of course, history had so much trouble figuring out how to categorize this music that we basically had to invent a term to describe what Beethoven was doing. And I think that's really the genesis of the word romanticism, this term which we use to describe music from the 19th century. In any textbook, what you'll read about in the first chapter, in the introduction to that chapter on romanticism, is going to be all about Beethoven. It's going to have to be, because how else do you square this kind of sound? So Beethoven, we're now getting into the later works. We're now getting into this last phase of his life, the late 18-teens, the 1820s. Beethoven would, of course, die in 1827. And when he died, 20,000 people turned out for his funeral along the streets of Vienna, a little bit different than the 12 people who came to Mozart's funeral. And before he died, of course, he would, to use that phrase I used earlier, bequeath unto posterity some of the most memorable, some of the most seismic pieces in terms of how they affect listeners. And so to really focus on one piece that achieves that effect, we're going to focus our efforts next week, and we're going to cast our gaze towards the Ninth Symphony, and especially the finale. I'd also like to start next week by looking at some of the more abstract music Beethoven was writing around 1825-26, and to do that, we're going to look at his string quartets. We have neglected the string quartets necessarily. There has not been time to discuss them, and of course I probably betrayed my own bias as a keyboardist in playing and focusing on piano repertoire. Next week we're going to look at Opus 131, the string quartet in C-sharp minor, which doesn't have 4 movements, which would be traditional. It has 7. So we'll talk about that and the Ninth Symphony. I look forward to seeing everybody. Have a great night. Get home safe.